Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and today I'm here with my Extension Dairy Team colleagues, Gail Carpenter, State Extension Dairy Specialist, and Fred Hall, our Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, as we discuss today's topic with our guest. So welcome back to the podcast, Gail and Fred.
Always
Thank
good
you.
to be here. Yep.
Yeah, so today we're delighted to have on our podcast Luiz Ferraretto, Assistant Professor and Extension Specialist with University of Wisconsin Madison. Luiz has spent a lot of his career in research and extension interest with applied nutrition and animal management. His program is focused on understanding and improving starch and fiber utilization by dairy cows, corn silage and high moisture corn quality and digestibility, the use of alternative byproducts as feed ingredients, and supplementation of feed additives to lactating dairy cows, and the development of on-farm and lab techniques for forage and feed analysis. So happy to have you on here, Luiz, and looks like you're involved in a lot of things with dairy nutrition and forage management. So why don't you, before we start today's topic, give us a little bit more about your background and a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me today. Always a pleasure. And, as you said, a lot of what I do, it sounds like a lot of different things, but they are all somehow connected, right? So basically, a little bit about me. I'm from Brazil. I moved to the United States in 2009 for a internship, and then I stayed for master's and PhD here in Wisconsin. Then I moved to the Minor Institute for a short postdoc, and then University of Florida for 4 years as an assistant professor, and came back to Wisconsin in 2020. The goals of my research, I believe they never change overall. I was very fortunate about that. So I have been working on especially carbohydrates, right? How can we improve starch and fiber utilization? And I believe that corn silage is a key aspect of that. So very happy in being able to discuss a little bit corn silage. It's definitely one of my favorite topics to talk about. So.
Yeah, and just before we were getting on this podcast, we were just discussing the variability of corn silage season harvest and what that might look like this upcoming year. And it's going to be upon us in a few weeks, it looks like. So as we're recording this podcast early August. And so I think today we'd like to just discuss, kind of laying that foundation for proper corn silage harvest and storing to ultimately feed our dairy herd of the next year, because, what we put up this fall is going to really tell how our cows perform in the next year, and we want to make sure we're doing that properly. So we'll go ahead and dive into some of our discussion here. And I know, Luiz, you were talking a little bit about your research, and you're part of our 4-state dairy nutrition management conference and providing a lot of our research updates in this area. So are there some key concepts of what is happening in research right now that we should be considering for this year's corn silage harvest?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the corn silage related research is focused on either improving nutritive value or improving fermentation. And I think those are key topics, not only for this year, right, but for pretty much every harvesting season. As at the end of the day, our goal should always be to preserve the highest amount of nutrients that we can, but also optimize the quality of those nutrients. So anything that we can use to improve nutritive value, or alternatively to ensure the fermentation is better, and consequently that we save more nutrients for dairy cows or beef cows, I think that would be ideal. No?
We've had a pretty wet year, which is weird, right? Like the past couple of years, we've been thinking a lot about drought-stressed corn, and what to do in a lot of drier times with our corn silage. What considerations should producers have for a wet year like we're having this year?
Yeah, that's a great comment. And we are seeing that here in Wisconsin as well, right? A lot of variation on when people was actually able to plant corn. So we may have actually a longer window of harvesting which is not great, right? Because you may enter some of the harvesting season when it's kind of getting cold, which is certainly bad for fermentation, right? In theory, bacteria likes warm weather, and so they can proliferate fast and so on. But in terms of wet years, I think something that is very important is we have to be careful with when do we harvest, right? Because if we have prolonged rains getting too close to harvest, then we need to make sure that first, we don't delay too much, right? Because we don't want to delay maturity of those plants, but also we want to be careful with how wet the soil is and how much mud we are bringing back to the silo, right? Because at the end of the day, the soil has a lot of microorganisms, right? And some of those we actually don't want in silage because it may either compromise fermentation or cause other issues during fermentation, like mycotoxins, for example, right? So I think those are key aspects that we have to pay closer attention because if you either delay too much harvest, you may reduce nutritive value, but if you also bring a lot of mud, you may also reduce nutritive value in a different way. So.
Do you think we see a higher risk for mycotoxins this year?
I don't
I
think
mean,
it's a
it's hard to know, right? But
yeah, no, absolutely. I don't think it's gonna be higher, okay? Because I do think when under draw stress, I think it's more likely to see mycotoxins than under wet conditions. But I do think that both conditions could cause some concerns, right? I think that my particular concern about that is to bring too much soil and potentially Clostridia. I know that for corn silage, Clostridia is not really a big issue, at least as far as we know. But we want to make sure we don't have a lot of yeast and mold counts either, right? Because if you bring a lot of yeast and molds, when you open that silo later in the year, especially when you reach warm weather again, maybe mid-spring or late spring, you will see those proliferating quite fast. And then basically the silage goes bad quite fast as well, right? That's when you start seeing a lot of the feed getting too warm at the feed bunk and so on. So I think those are different issues that could be there. But yeah, as you said, predicting mycotoxins is something that is virtually impossible, right? One thing I always complain about when discussing with my students is, well, we often see surveys about mycotoxins and how they keep increasing, but usually years where we see an increase is because more people analyze samples too. And basically you only analyze samples for mycotoxins if you have concerns, right? So because of that, it's quite difficult to evaluate if we are increasing this rate of mycotoxins or not, or prevalence, if you will, right? So.
another thing that I know you and I have talked about a bit, but for the benefit of our listeners, we try to balance proper dry matter at harvest with proper maturity at harvest. So can you talk a little bit about, in general, how we should be assessing when corn silage is ready to be harvested? And specifically, when we have more moisture than like we've been having this year, how does that impact making the decision about when we need to be harvesting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, finding the sweet spot for a dairy is not an easy task, right? And you need to balance quantity, right, which more mature corn silage often will provide, with quality, which more immature silage would be the ideal goal, if you will, right? Typically, for research, we talk a lot about maturity as dry matter concentration. And dry matter is a good metric, but I don't think it should be used alone. Okay, I think recently, especially in wet years, as you describe, we see hybrids that are much better in health traits, which is outstanding. I think the seed industry does a great job with that, right? But because of that, we may have plants that are a little bit more on the wet side, but the kernels are still drying fast, right? So in my opinion, there is some disparity between grain and plant dry matter. Right? I know some people may disagree with that, but I hear that a lot in the field, and we see that a lot with our own fields. So what I typically suggest is use a combination of both, okay? A kernel metric and a plant dry matter metric. For plant dry matter, typically what I suggest is try to target about 33, 35% dry matter, if possible, right? It's not always possible to everyone, but with a kernel maturity of about 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the kernel milk line, right? I think if you're able to get something like this, you should have a good amount of starch in a plant that's wet enough to provide good fermentation, but is not too wet that you will be losing a lot of effluent, right? So I think this is a good starting point. Obviously, if you have to make a decision based on, well, I still think it's too wet, I need a little bit more, then wait a little bit. Just be careful to don't go too close to 40% dry matter or so, because that's when we start seeing a little bit more issues than usual with processing as well as fermentation, too coarse particles, and so on. So,
do we see changes in these targets when we're dealing with BMR corn?
That's a great question. I don't have a specific numbers for BMR compared to conventional, but I know that some people prefer to go a little bit later with BMR to accumulate a little bit more yield, because BMR has some yield drags associated with that. Part of the issues that I see with doing that, assuming is an issue, is that BMR, some BMR, not all BMR, so you have to be careful with my comments as well. They may have kernels that are a little bit harder and smaller than the typical conventional hybrids. So because of that, I don't want to delay too much and get those hard BMR kernels. So because otherwise you may have a little bit less starch than a conventional hybrid and less digestible starch, and you don't want to have that, right? Again, not all hybrids are like this, and sometimes research is a little bit outdated compared to the most recent genetics that are out there, okay? But keep that in mind that this can happen, so.
So then it really is a topic to have that kernel processor dialed in, because they know those kernels are harder. Any comments?
Yeah, absolutely. I think regardless of the type of hybrid, right, you need to ensure that kernel processing is adequate, right? You need to be very tight with those rows, make sure they are as close as possible. A lot of times it's also important to make sure your chop length is actually shorter, right? So you can make sure not only the rows break kernels, but some of those knives hit those kernels as well, right? So I do think that this is very important regardless of the hybrid, but it may become more important in situations where you have either drier material or BMR that's going a little bit dry as well, right? Actually, if you go back to some discussions we have, like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, right? People start suggesting, hey, perhaps we should have different settings for harvest depending on maturity. Obviously, we don't have a specific guideline for that, but I know that a good way of making sure you break more kernels and make sure your particles are proper sizes, as plants start to be more mature, you start reducing chop length and makes those rows tighter and tighter, because this way you can guarantee that. However, I think when it comes to kernel processing, something that is key is not only make sure that settings are correct, but also make sure that you pay attention to what is coming from the field, right? Are the samples truly processed, right? Sometimes everything looks correct in terms of settings, but you don't see that happening, right? There is row wear, maybe there is the speed of the harvester and so on, which are topics that as a nutritionist, I don't test a lot, okay? Or not at all, if you will, right? But we know that it happens quite frequently. So you need to make sure you collect samples, go through those. There are different assays out there that you can use real time to see if those kernels are processed or not, right? There's one that we call the flotation technique. Grab a sample, put into water. You are able to separate fiber and kernel and see that. Some of the seed companies, they provide cups to you to do something exactly like this. And I think those cup measurements are essential to make sure that your kernel processing is going well.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. How often should you be looking at kernel processing? How do you have that conversation if you're using a custom harvester with them about the importance of kernel processing? How do you kind of approach troubleshooting?
Yeah, absolutely. In my opinion, you should evaluate samples as much as you can, right? And the reason for that is, especially if you have multiple harvesters or, harvesting for a little bit further to the silo than usual, whenever you see an issue, maybe there are 10, 12 loads that were already harvested, right? So that's why I think we should pay very close attention and collect as much samples as possible, okay? If possible, every single load, right? I know that this is not always possible. It's a lot of extra work. Sometimes you may need a dedicated person just to do that. But if you can assess processing very often, the likelihood of catching an error is very high. So this way you can fix it faster, right? Especially because we have to remember that the amount of silage going through those rows, it's huge, right? It's tons after tons after tons. So they start going apart, right? It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. So the faster you catch the error or that's happening, the better. Now, going to the second part of your question, well, how do we discuss that? I think it's at the end of the day, our job to show the custom harvester why that is so important to us, right? And I think we have enough evidence today to say that, hey, if you have a couple intact kernels, you're actually having some issues later on because the cows cannot digest those kernels, right? You very likely will see those in the manure. And the likelihood of improving milk production, if those are very well broken or extremely damaged, it's very high. Right. So I think that's a good way to having a discussion, showing the importance of that and so on. And I think those tests that I mentioned, like the cup or flotation or anything related to that, is quite important because you can grab those samples and show them and say, hey, that's the visual assessment I just made. Here's what's going on, right? And I think we have a good amount of guidelines out there now that can help us to navigate this situation, show, hey, that's the potential loss that we have.
I was just going to say, those are some good guidelines as we're talking about, getting that corn silage out of the field. And then, now we're getting it into our bunkers, bags, silos. A lot of what I see in Northeast Iowa, and Fred, you probably see this a lot, Northwest Iowa's filling bunkers and getting that packed appropriately. You got any good guidelines or best management practices for packing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, packing is crucial for corn silage fermentation and preservation, right? I think at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we are bringing enough material to create thin layers, right? And that we have enough tractor weight that can pack that silage and make sure that most of the oxygen is eliminated so fermentation can start as soon as we have it sealed, right, and reach an aerobic environment. Obviously, it's easier said than done because there are a lot of factors that contribute to this variation, right? So particle size is one of those. That's why I have some concerns about too mature corn silage because if the particles are too coarse, it requires more time packing, okay, or more weight, right? Usually more time because it's harder to remove all the air from the coarser particles, right? So this is a key aspect associated with that. You also want to make sure that the layers are not too thick, that do not allow the tractor to properly pack it, and so on. And last, I think that what I mentioned about silage hygiene becomes quite important, right? Because if you have a lot of soil, a lot of mud coming into the silo, even though it may be properly packed, you may have some undesired microorganisms there compromising part of that fermentation.
One of our dairymen out here in Northwest Iowa is great silage man, but he'll put on the unsalted whey or neutral whey onto the top of his pile before he covers. Several of them use coarse salt on top before they cover it. What about these additives? What do they do in the silage pile?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different additives that you can consider, right? I think the top of the pile it's a complex environment because it differs from everywhere else in the silage pile, right? Usually because it's the area that is closer to oxygen, and often we'll have extra oxygen because you cannot 100% eliminate that, right? So said that, that's typically the area where you see a little bit poorer fermentation and where you see some of the losses with yeast and molds that are very obvious visually, right? So because of that, there are different additives that you could put on the top of the silage or the pile, and then help mitigate some of those issues. I think salt is one of those that people consider to help with part of that, okay? I'm not the biggest fan of salt, okay? I actually like more biological additives rather than salt or whey, but I know that some people use those, and to a certain extent, they may be successful if that's working for them, right? I do think that the reason why they add whey is to primarily reduce a little bit the pH if it's some sort of acid whey, but also provide some extra sugar so bacteria can proliferate faster, right? In the terms of salt, is more to eliminate some of those yeast and molds potential proliferation. What I like in terms of additives, and it depends from every situation, is microbial inoculants. Okay, I think that those are quite good depending on the scenario. For corn silage, usually you have enough bacteria that it should ferment well, right? So I would prefer to have an inoculant that provides bacteria that change fermentation a little bit later during fermentation season towards acetate. So this way we can have less issues with aerobic stability during feed out phase, right? So those would be my preference in general, okay? If you know you have issues with fermentation, then I would change my opinion here and I'll tell you, hey, use a microbial inoculant that have some extra bacteria that will help expedite the process and make sure the fermentation is very fast, right? Other options for the top of the silage that are out there are different organic acids that are available that you could use. And I think those would have a similar effect. It's just trying to control a little bit of this worse fermentation, if you will, that happens in the top of the pile. So,
What about safety? What reminders are important right now as we're looking forward to starting harvest, like Jen said, hopefully pretty soon? What should we be thinking about right now to make sure that we have a safe harvest?
well, safety is definitely the most important management practice, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure everybody goes back home. So said that, I think the hardest thing during silage season is that there are a lot of equipment working in a small space and a lot of people, right? So when that happens, we are more likely to see potential issues. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that people pay close attention to their surroundings, right? Make sure that they know everything that's going on around them, even though it's a lot going on during silage season, right? And make sure that those issues do not happen.
One of the things that I remind producers regularly is we're not machines. We need to get adequate sleep, adequate nutrition, and stay hydrated. So whether it's the FFA chapter bringing a sandwich and something to drink, make sure that your guys chasing trucks, running choppers, take a minute, that they stay hydrated, that they well nourished, and then maybe you have to have a second shift, but make sure everybody gets adequate sleep.
All good tips as we start our next corn silage harvest season here. And as we kind of wrap up our podcast here, Luis and Gail, do you have resources on both of your websites that we can refer our audience to?
We do have a webinar series on our YouTube channel, and you can also find that on our website, extension.iastate.edu/dairy team. You can find a lot of resources there, including a silage webinar series that we had a couple years ago that featured Luis, as well as some other silage experts. And stay tuned to that website as well for more fact sheets and resources as they become available.
Yeah, we do have some options available online from the University of Wisconsin Extension. Basically, either if you go to the crops and soils or the dairy topic hub, there are a lot of different material covering not only corn silage, but other crops as well. So you can have an idea of a couple of different things associated with harvest. We also try to store online some of our recorded videos from our webinars, which once in a while is heavily focused on silage as well. Said that, in a couple of weeks, we do have one talking about silage shrink. So I'll cover some of those discussions we just had about how to mitigate dry matter loss associated with fermentation and covering so on, in case you have interest. And I'll be happy to share any other information related to any of those fact sheets as well.
I want to thank you for being on the podcast here, Luis, and Gail and Fred. Thanks also for joining in on the discussion here today. And we look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.